he doesn't have the capability. And therefore, Putin is scared of NATO getting properly involved. And whilst Putin's changing his economy into a total war economy and building up his nation to do that, I personally think we'll see a change in the messaging that's coming out from him as soon as his election is over and done with on the 17th of March. And that's when we'll start to see more pressure coming to pull more people out from the population to go onto the front line. We'll see more pressure on his defence industrial base and other industries to go into military manufacturing. We'll see him putting more pressure internationally from a geopolitical perspective through Iran, through North Korea, through China, through any means that he can to further destabilise things as other elections are happening around the world. So we'll see an uptake in activity out of Putin after his election, but he will be worried, and the thing that will keep him worried is this uncertainty. In Russian terms, they've got a doctrine called maskirovka. It's all about masking, and it's masking your true intentions. And I think Macron has played quite a good piece in maskirovka, Russian doctrine, back to Vladimir Putin.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen. Today we're talking about the war in Ukraine with former Colonel Philip Ingram, MBE, a former military intelligence officer with more than 26 years of experience in the UK Armed Forces and a former NATO planner. Philip's now a military analyst and commentator and a regular guest on Frontline. Philip, always appreciate your time. Welcome back.
Always good to be here.
Let's begin with some news we've had in the last few days. Another success story for Ukraine, remarkable success story really, in the Black Sea. The sinking of the patrol ship, the Sergei Kotov, off the Kerch Strait. How much significance would you put on that, Philip?
It's hugely significant, like any of the capital ships that have gone. We put it into context. Ukraine doesn't have an operational navy, and it's sunk 25% approximately of the Russian Black Sea fleet, including with the Sergei Kotov, its most modern patrol ship, only launched a couple of years ago, launched after Vladimir Putin's re-invasion of Ukraine. And it's now been promoted to submarine alongside some other capital ships. But it's significant in that it is an operation using drones, but sea drones, very successfully. We get the pictures back from it, so it's easy to get the battle damage assessment and to confirm that these things have happened. And it's being run by the Ukraine's military intelligence organization, the GUR, headed by General Budanov. And this is one of the success stories, I think, from a Ukrainian perspective of the conflict to date.
And he's a very interesting figure because obviously in recent weeks and months, there's been a lot of focus on General Syrskyi taking over from Zaluzhny, but actually Budanov, in terms of the impact he's had on this war, particularly in terms of damaging the Black Sea fleet, is remarkable. Yeah,
Syrskyi is responsible for effectively the one dimension of the conflict. It's more complex than that, but it's the movement of the front line. It's the conventional military tactics. Whereas Budanov, heading Ukraine's military intelligence, it's not just providing the decision-making support to those frontline operations, but he's also resurrected the old Second World War special operations executive type operations. And we've seen that with Russian factories suddenly catching fire, Russian oil refineries bursting into flames, drone attacks against Russian airfields, either in occupied Ukraine and Crimea or in Russia itself. Some of the planning that goes behind commando raids to destroy air defence capabilities before the Ukrainians fly drones into different areas. And of course, what's going on inside the Black Sea. This is in effect hollowing out the Russians' capability from behind, whilst the Russians are still managing to hold this front line, this defensive front line, which they're having some success, very limited success in advancing in at the moment. But no matter how good that front line is, if the foundations are hollowed out from behind, at some stage it will collapse.
And that's a really good point, because understandably there's a lot of focus on what is happening on the front line. There's been this positional warfare for months, and as you say, Philip, Russia have had successes recently, notably with the capture of Avdiivka. But perhaps we need to be paying more attention, as you say, to what's happening behind it.
I think we need to look at everything from a multi-dimensional perspective. This is like 4-dimensional or 5-dimensional or 6-dimensional chess. I'm getting into Star Trek analogies here almost, but it is that complex. And if you focus just on the movement of the front line, you're missing the complete picture. And it's important that we analyse it and that our military masters or political masters analyse it from that wider perspective, because it's too easy to say the Russians are having success now. They are, and they're advancing slowly. Ukrainians are holding them back. The cost of the Russians is huge. It's 900 to 1,200 men a day being killed or injured to a point where they're removed from the battlefield. They're losing 20 plus tanks, 20 plus pieces of artillery a day. The Russian logistics system, everyone says, oh, it's brilliant, it can supply as much artillery and everything else. It's relying on Iran for missiles, Iran for its drone systems, it's relying on North Korea for its ammunition. So the Russian defence industrial base is not in a good position. The Western defence industrial base has been caught effectively with its pants down because it hasn't got the capacity to produce the numbers of shells and everything else that are expected to maintain Western stocks and to supply the sort of conflict we're seeing, which is why there's been trouble in supplying Ukraine with what it needs. And that's why Ukraine is having to trade some territory for time. That is a military operation, that can be a planned military operation, and we're not seeing a rout from anywhere. We're seeing the Ukrainians slowly but surely allowing the Russians to advance in certain areas at huge cost to the Russians. We don't have full visibility of the cost to the Ukrainians. It will be significant, but it's that balance on the front line. Meanwhile, behind that, we're getting all this success from General Budanov and his GUR, or his military intelligence organisation.
Just on the Black Sea Fleet and the damage Ukraine has done to it since this war started, which is remarkable given, if you said 2 years ago that here we are in March 2024 and at least a quarter of the Russian Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed or rendered useless. I mean, not many people would have believed you 2 years ago. But why has Russia not been able to defend it better? If you read some of the Russian pro-Moscow military bloggers, they're incredibly critical of Russia's inability to defend it better. Why haven't they learned lessons?
There's two things we have to look at here. One, why is the Black Sea important to Russia? Why were they trying to dominate it? They were doing that to try and stop Ukrainian grain exports. 10 to 15% of the world's food comes out of Ukraine, and it impacts some of the poorest nations first and foremost. And if Russia could control that, and it tried to stop it, then Russia has got greater geopolitical influence on the decision-making and the support of Ukraine. Russia's now focused back onto keeping its Black Sea Fleet as close to Russian territorial water and away almost from its Ukrainian captured bases as it possibly can. And that's because they are very old school. They lack initiative in what they're doing, and therefore they haven't been trained in dealing with this new type of threat. And it's virtually impossible to train an organisation like the Russian military whilst they're in combat and change their tactics. They're doing that in the front line as much as they can, but at huge cost. They're probably trying to do it in their Black Sea Fleet, but again at huge cost to capital ships, and they're losing those ships too fast. So actually they're going into a more protective mode of moving a lot of their ships across into Russian ports, away from the Crimean ports, and keeping them very tight into close territorial waters. But what the Russians are trying to do is protect the Kerch Bridge more than anything, and that's why they're still having to patrol out there. The Ukrainians are turning around saying, hey, you patrol the Kerch Bridge, we're going to remove you from that, because that means that we are coming for that bridge. And this is all part of the wider information operation as well. They're being very successful in putting that message across. It's not if, it's when.
I'm glad you mentioned the Kerch Bridge, because of course we've had this leak from a German Air Force discussion, a kind of conference call. Russian sources intercepted it, and they claim that what was being discussed was Germany sending Taurus cruise missiles to be used specifically to attack the Kerch Bridge. First of all, from an intelligence failure point of view, how big a blow is that leak?
The Russians probably knew everything that was being said in that conversation anyway. But the fact that the Russians have managed to intercept a senior German officer who clearly arrogantly was using an unsecured network, and the Russians have been able to put that out at a time when there's discussions inside Germany about sending Taurus missiles, and then pressure coming in from the rest of the NATO nations and other contributing nations onto Germany from a political and from a military perspective, is hugely embarrassing, if not damaging. It's very damaging indeed. And what Putin has done is he's identified the ability to find a potential fracture in or create a fracture in relations within NATO and elsewhere, and he's put the proverbial espionage knife in it and wiggled it to make it bigger, because naturally our intelligence agencies are not going to trust and our operational formations are not going to trust Germany with a lot of its information, because it could get leaked. But the other thing that I think hasn't quite come out of this yet, and people need to realise, is that the level of sophistication of the intelligence operation that the Russians have launched and run to be able to target this individual, target that conversation, to get a copy of the conversation, and then to put it out from an information operation perspective to create these fractures is significant. It's good old-fashioned, really capable espionage, and the Russians are good at it. They're very good at it. And if they've targeted the Germans like that, they're targeting the French, the Brits, the Americans, the Dutch, the Danes, every other NATO member in the same way. So senior NATO officers that are going around the world attending trade shows or conferences or on other business, they will be being watched by the Russians, and the Russians will be looking for similar opportunities to compromise them and exploit them. That's a lesson that I think many of our militaries have forgotten.
The content of what was being discussed, though, I mean, that is the kind of thing that maybe we need to look at.
Yeah.
Germany sending tourist missiles to Ukraine.
Yeah, it is. And there's pressure on Germany to send the tourist missiles. They're needed. They have got a slightly better range than the Storm Shadow or the Scalp, which is the same as the Storm Shadow. They've got a slightly better warhead for attacking that sort of environment. They would add that extra value to what's going on, potentially persuade the Americans, whenever they can stop linking aid to Ukraine to domestic politics, to send longer range ATACMS that would get in. You've got multiple ways of then attacking the Kerch Bridge and rendering it inoperative. And that's what the Ukrainians want. They want, whenever they fire, they decide to attack it properly, to have as good a percentage of chance of destroying it as possible. You don't want to do it in half measures, and then the Russians see how you've attacked and put their defenses in different positions, because it can then take months or even longer to get around those defenses in some other way.
Does the very fact that this conversation has apparently been taking place indicate that Germany are starting to ask some fundamental questions again? Because previously Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, has been adamant they will not deploy these tourist missiles to Ukraine.
Politicians are very good at being very firm and saying, we will not do this. He said, we're not going to send tanks. Germany is one of the biggest contributors of tanks through direct supply or through authorising the re-export of German Leopard tanks to Ukraine. Marder vehicles, Germany is one of the biggest contributors. So it's very interesting, this political dilemma that's going on. And if you look in through German politics, there's a lot of discussion about how compromised German politics and German politicians are by the Russians, and close links into historical links into Russian intelligence and everything else. You remember Vladimir Putin was an intelligence officer in East Germany for many years. Vladimir Putin and Angela Merkel got on well politically when they're going in. There's no indication that she was in any way, shape or form compromised. But there are those Russian links through the old East German links and everything that's gone on in there into current German politics. And German politics is a politics of a coalition. You cannot make firm decisions, and those elements in the coalition range from the Green Party, which has got huge power and is actually backing a lot of support for Ukraine, right through to more centrist politics that's in there. But Germany is also petrified at the rise of the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, the extreme right-wing element that's coming in, and that is impacting all of the decision making. And Chancellor Scholz, I think he does not like making firm decisions like this publicly that could be exploited politically. He's in a very precarious position politically.
It's a good point you raised about the links between, historically, German politicians and Russia. Of course, Gerhard Schröder, former Chancellor, is probably the most obvious example with his links to Gazprom. Yeah. I mean, I suppose that issue of whether European leaders are now asking themselves questions that they haven't up until this point brings us nicely on to what President Macron's been saying recently about whether NATO troops, or if you want to define it this way, troops from NATO countries could be deployed on the front line in Ukraine. Now, he made these comments about a week ago, and at the time it was unclear whether he was just floating this idea or whether indeed it was a slip of the tongue. He's doubled down on it since.
Yeah, he has.
What do you make of that?
Politics is fascinating at the minute, if it wasn't so serious, some people dying because of it. He's aiming his comments at two audiences. One, his domestic audience, because we've got elections coming up in the EU and everything else. So Macron is trying to push that. But also I think from an EU perspective, from a French perspective, he's aiming it at that wider EU audience, trying to come out and say, I'm the strong man of Europe now, and putting all this in, and look at what we're saying. In a way, he's right, but I do not see any practical way as it could happen. I've seen a potential plan where countries of willing will relieve Ukrainian troops on the Belarusian border, the border with Belarus, and elsewhere provide protection around some of the bases that there are inside Ukraine, allowing the Ukrainians to put their troops up onto the front line. But I can't see how that could happen practically, because if you're going to do that, you have to provide them with the necessary protection. That protection will include air defence protection. That would therefore mean that you would have potentially NATO air defence systems or air defence systems from a NATO contributing country surrounding their military inside Ukraine. If they engage a Russian aircraft or a Russian missile, that's then bringing them into direct conflict with Russia. Russia could then interpret that, and it becomes hugely complex. If you then bring the troops into another place where potentially the Russians could have a more direct effect on them, you're going to have to give them the air cover, the electronic warfare cover, the air defence cover, the armour that they need in the ground to protect themselves. You're bringing it up a next level, and that is not just one step up the ladder to escalation of this turning into a wider European war. It's several steps up. So I think there's a lot of politics behind it. Militarily, it's very difficult to see a practical way of doing that. Of course, nobody will ever confirm it, but there will almost certainly be advisors from different nations around inside Ukraine providing advice through different embassies and other military advice that's around the place. That doesn't mean that they're directly engaged in what's going on, but I would be gobsmacked if there weren't advisors that are in there from different nations. Countries, of course, will deny that because it would be exploited from an information perspective by the Russians, and that's the other embarrassing thing about the German Air Force General's leak, because he suggested that there were British and French troops on the ground with regard to the Storm Shadow and the Scalp missiles and getting those onto the Ukrainian aircraft. How
seriously do you think Vladimir Putin will take President Macron's comments? I mean, there's been a lot of pushback from Kremlin spokespeople, as you might expect, saying this would lead to escalation, which obviously it would. But do you think Putin thinks Macron is bluffing, or do you think he fears that this might signal a shift in European opinion?
That's the one thing that I think Macron may want Putin to, the position he wants Putin to be in, on the horns of a dilemma. He doesn't know. And this is where it's important that you keep him that. If you look at the red lines that Russia's come out with the whole way through, there's been red lines on tanks, there's been red lines on long-range missiles, there's been red lines on HIMARS, there's been red lines on, every time the West says it's going to supply this, Putin turns around and says, we're going to go for nuclear escalation. And it's not got there. He doesn't have the capability. And therefore, Putin is scared of NATO getting properly involved. And whilst Putin's changing his economy into a total war economy and building up his nation to do that, we'll see. I personally think we'll see a change in the messaging that's coming out from him as soon as his election is over and done with on the 17th of March, and that's when we'll start to see more pressure coming to pull more people out from the population to go into the front line. We'll see more pressure on his defence industrial base and other industries to go into military manufacturing. We'll see him putting more pressure internationally from a geopolitical perspective through Iran, through North Korea, through China, through any means that he can to further destabilise things as other elections are happening around the world. So we'll see an uptake in activity out of Putin after his election, but he will be worried, and the thing that will keep him worried is this uncertainty. In Russian terms, they've got a doctrine called maskirovka. It's all about masking, and it's masking your true intentions. And I think Macron has played quite a good piece in maskirovka Russian doctrine back to Vladimir Putin.
Philip, you mentioned the Russian presidential election later this month. Do you think it is almost certain that we will see Vladimir Putin come out and announce a fresh wave of mobilisation? Is that almost a certainty at this point?
I think what he wants to do is get his political mandate, as he will refer to it, re-established. We know the results of the election already, and every election he wants a slightly greater percentage mandate, and it'll almost certainly come out with a few percentage points greater than the last election. And then he will use that mandate to put pressure back onto the Russian people, and we'll see an uptake in his messaging to turn around and say that this is not a conflict against Ukraine, this is a conflict against NATO. This is a conflict against Western countries that are trying to destroy Russia as a country. And he will then use that to double down on mobilisation. And we'll see it probably happening, and I'm assessing all of this, but we'll see this probably happening incrementally. So he will double down on those that are avoiding mobilisation at the moment. He will start to mobilise more people who are falling foul of the criminal justice system and anything else. So people will be arrested for, and I'm going to be slightly flippant here, walking on the cracks of the pavement and then suddenly find themselves off in the front line. He can do that without then having a degree of political call-up. It's whether his training capacity can meet the numbers of people that are going to get through. But he will then use his mandate to increase the amount of money that's going into the defence industrial base across Russia, because he needs his aircraft replaced, his tanks replaced, his ammunition replaced. There's only so much that he can get from North Korea and Iran. We're already seeing elements of Chinese technology coming in, and supplies that are coming through China. He will be using every friendly country around the world that he can to purchase military material for him, and then ship that into Russia to try and get round your direct sanctions that are happening elsewhere. So we'll see a subtle but definite change in gear afterwards, and it'll set the conditions. He'll then be in place for another few years. He's in place for as long as he wants, but another few years with that mandate. So he's got the authority, or he will see it as the authority, to bring that up to general mobilisation if he needs to again.
Which begs the question, why has it taken this long for that argument to be articulated? I've heard some analysts say actually it was a strategic mistake from the West, from NATO, at the outset to say we're not going to put NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. Because even if you don't privately have any intention of doing it, if you publicly rule it out, you are showing your hand to your opponent.
Correct. And this is where I think our Western politicians don't understand the tactics of information in a geopolitical conflict environment. We used to be good at it. During the Second World War, Operation Fortitude, we created a fake army which had blow-up tanks, wooden aircraft, communications that had been made up. It had a real general, Omar Bradley, the first US Army group. It gave real press statements out. It gave real interviews on the radio and into the newspapers, but it was all a bluff. Part of that bluff was also Operation Mincemeat, which had a dead body with most secret plans that we knew were going to hit the Hitler's desk, and that was talking about the Allies coming into Southern Europe through Greece and not through the toe of Italy. The whole of Fortitude was about convincing Hitler we were going in different places, and the northern bit was convincing him we were going to attack through the Pas-de-Calais and not through Normandy. We were brilliant at it in the Second World War because we had control. Our politicians, our military commanders have forgotten the power of information today, and they're not proactive in its planning, they're not proactive in its use. And this is where I think there's been a light bulb moment with someone, with President Macron, who's suddenly gone, oh, this is good. Whether that's by accident or deliberate design, I'd hope it's by deliberate design. We're going to see a change.
Just finally, Philip, because of perhaps what we've been seeing on the front line with Russia making some significant incremental gains, there is a slight air of pessimism that some in the West have currently towards the conflict. Do you have optimism? And if so, just outline the optimistic case for Ukraine at the moment.
Well, there's a slight degree of pessimism in the West. It's Ukraine fatigue setting in. And again, this is something that Vladimir Putin wants to exploit. And there is a degree of pessimism, I think, within Ukraine itself, because the Ukrainian military are tired. They've been fighting for 2 years, and it's impossible to explain just how draining this sort of fighting is. And if they're seeing the support from the West waning, then this is where Ukraine's political leadership. President Zelensky is going to earn his spurs even more by trying to keep the motivation going and keep the motivation coming in from the West. This is where Macron's statement is very helpful indeed. We're 2 years in. I think we're still going to be discussing this in 2 years' time. Once Western ammunition gets into the Ukrainians again and their supplies are coming in, at that same time we're going to see an improvement in the Ukrainian Air Force capability with F-16s and other things come in. Hopefully Germany will change its political stance and Taurus missiles will go in. America will change its stance and we'll see longer range ATACMS missiles going in. We're already seeing NATO nations turning around saying, we don't care if you use our weapons to attack into Russia. That is sending a very clear statement to Vladimir Putin each time. So if we can get that supply restarted again, I think the Ukrainians have got the wherewithal to take the fight properly back to the Russians and start to have some successes. The defences that they're fighting against are stronger than anything we've seen in any conflict ever before. So it relies on this hollowing out from behind and this collapse of a front line so that the Ukrainians can get through. It's still going to be very difficult, which is why I say we'll still be talking about this in at least 2 years' time.
Philip, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to The Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.